So my name is Beyang. I'm the CTO and co-founder of SourceGraph. And what we do is we're essentially a developer tools company that has two main products. One is a web application that searches your entire code base extremely quickly. And the other one is a browser extension that adds code intelligence, things like jump to def, find references, things that you'd expect to have in an IDE to GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, code review tools in general, and other code hosts. The things that motivated us to start using GraphQL at SourceGraph were two main things. One was developer productivity, and the other one was front-end performance. So on the developer productivity side, what we were finding we're doing is we had a kind of a REST API at that point, and we found that we as a development team were writing a lot of REST boilerplate every time we wanted to add a new piece of functionality. So we'd add the thing on the database side, and then we'd have an idea of what we wanted from the front end, and then we'd have to go and kind of stuff this into the REST model of doing things. So think about could we add this as like an extension of an existing resource? Should we create a new resource endpoint? And it just seemed like a lot of wasted effort, because at the end of the day we had like a data model on the back end that was constrained by database requirements, and we had a front end data model that was quite similar to the back end data model, and we were just like we had to translate from the back end data model into this REST model, which was quite different from both the front end and the back end. And then on the front end we'd have to reinflate that data into the front end data model, and it was kind of like squeezing two things that are very similar into this like very narrow tube that's not similar to either of them. So it was a lot of wasted effort. The second motivator was performance. So with REST, what we were finding is given the constraints of kind of the REST philosophy, for a single front end feature, for instance, that might require requests to a couple different REST endpoints. You'd have to fetch the user, you'd have to fetch repository metadata, you might have to fetch dependency information, which we provide through our API, just to serve kind of a single user request. And little by little that starts to add up. And the promise of GraphQL was you could issue a single request to the back end for describing exactly what you want in terms of the data, and you get that back all at once. So that's nice. So I think companies thinking about adopting GraphQL in 2019, the ones that should be thinking about it are the ones building essentially like modern web applications. I actually think like the question, it shouldn't be why adopt GraphQL. It should always be what is the best solution for my problem. And so if you're building a rich web application, you're going to have back-end schema constraints, and you're going to have a front-end data model that you want to reflect what the functionality that you want to provide to your end user. And so there's going to be some interface between the front end and the back end, and the question is what is the best solution to that? And if you look at I guess like the thing that GraphQL is mostly replacing these days is REST. And if you look at the REST model, it seems like it was created in an age of the internet where things were very kind of request driven. A lot of user actions would result in an HTTP get or a post, kind of like that Rails post to the back end and get a response, and then I'm redirected to a new web page. Whereas if you think about what the things that you want to do in kind of a more modern, rich web application, it's like everything. The user clicks a button and you want to send a request back, and then you need to serve this widget in your page that pulls data from about 3 different things. For that, it just seems like natural that GraphQL it just intuitively is more reflective of the things that you want to request from the back end. There are a couple things that make GraphQL enjoyable to work with. I'd say, for starters, the fact that you're not writing a lot of API boilerplate, is a clear win. Anything that makes it so that the code you're writing is more like interesting and not boilerplate, that obviously makes your job as a developer a lot more fun. The other thing that's related to that is the editing experience. So GraphQL you define your schema, it's this very well-defined thing, and because of that, you can have great editor support. You can have support both in your actual local text editor, and you can also get the same functionality in a web editor, live through things like GraphQL or GraphQL, as some people call it, and it just lets you kind of play around and experiment with the types of requests that you can make against your API in a much more fluid fashion. You don't have to wait for anything to recompile, or you don't have to write a bunch of like curl requests. You can just hop into that little editor and type away. It's got autocomplete, it's got suggestions and syntax highlighting, and it's a very intuitive and fluid experience. So as far as performance improvements and optimizations are concerned, we at SourceGraph take that very seriously. Our product is for developers, and developers really like speed, especially with respect to asking questions and finding answers about their code. Anything that takes longer than a couple hundred milliseconds, it hits that point where your brain's like, oh, let's go make some coffee, and it takes you out of flow. And so the gains that we've seen with GraphQL is, I think a lot of the gains have to do with reducing the number of client-server round trips it takes to serve a user action or user request. With our legacy REST API, oftentimes it was several, at least, round trips for querying different kind of resources that were needed to serve a user request. And with GraphQL, that can be condensed into a single request with a very easily readable query language that describes exactly what you're looking for. If you're looking to get started with GraphQL at your company, I'd say the best way to get started is kind of the same way that you'd get started with anything, and that is to look at how other people are doing it. And with respect to GraphQL, I think there's kind of two levels to do that at. There is kind of the playing around with the live API level, and then there's looking at the source code level. So in terms of like playing around with the live API, go find a product out there that has an existing GraphQL API. For instance, SourceGraph has one, GitHub has one, and for SourceGraph, for instance, we actually have a live, GraphQL editor embedded in our product that lets you play around with our API, and using that, you can easily get a sense of what queries are possible, and it gives you a sense of what the query language looks like, and what at the end of the day you'll have to write to get data back for a given request. And then at the other end of things, at the source code level, go on GitHub, go on SourceGraph, explore open source code that uses GraphQL in the source code, and see how they define their schema, see how they translate their schema and generate code from it. I think most expert GraphQL users rely heavily on code generation to essentially get as most out of that schema definition as possible. You can do a lot of amazing things. The tooling ecosystem is fantastic, so definitely learn by example. So if you're looking to move from REST to GraphQL, I'd suggest the best way to do that is to think about what the MVP or minimal viable product of that transition would look like. If you have a microservices architecture, there's probably one particular service that has a relatively small API that you can translate and start from there. If you have a more monolithic or large service architecture, there's probably a single part of your API that could be translated over while leaving the remainder of your API intact. For us at SourceGraph, the way we did it was we have a lot of different types of I guess you would call them resources in the REST world. In our API, you can query things about users, you can query things about repositories, you can query things about the structure of the data, the code as data itself, like dependencies and that sort of thing. And we just picked one of those and decided to move that over first. And we could do it we did it very incrementally. So, at SourceGraph, we work with a lot of developer organizations, and what we see is a lot of people are moving away from REST APIs toward GraphQL today. And, from what I've seen personally, the reason seems to be a lot of folks, it really comes down to, what kind of application do you want to develop today? And more, our customers and our users are developing, rich, single-page web applications, and less so applications of the type, like Rails 1.0 applications. They're not so much doing that anymore. And if you're developing a rich web application and you want kind of this seamless transition between your backend data model and the data model on the front end, GraphQL just seems like the intuitive choice. REST was really built and created in a world that was very HTTP request driven. And it was a good fit for the era of the internet when it came of age. But the world has kind of moved on. Users have moved on, and software organizations are responding to that, and they're moving on as well. So the effect that GraphQL has on teams, disparate teams working in different product areas, any sort of situation where you're on one team inside a large organization, there's some other team that might want to use the thing that you're building, but you don't really talk to that much. I really view that as kind of a weak form of being in an external organization almost. And it kind of reduces this question of, why have a public API in the first place? Well, if you are an organization and you want to expose functionality to developers outside your organization who knows who they are, what they want to do, and whether you'll ever actually, hop on a call with them and talk face to face. But the point is that, you have something of value that they want to obtain, and they will also add value to you by using the thing that you're building. And so that that's why you have a public API in the first place. That's why you make it well documented and expose it so that other developers can come to you and use your stuff without having to sit down and have a brain dump in front of you for an hour in a meeting. And it works very much the same way inside an organization. Obviously it's easier to sit down with someone if they're in the same company or the same org, but a lot of times it's pretty hard, it turns out. People are busy, they have their own OKRs and objectives that they need to satisfy, and their heads down, and they would rather not be bothered by random external requests that come in. And so really how GraphQL helps is that by virtue of being a better fit for the types of functionality that developers want to access, like the rich web app type of functionality that they want from an API, it just reduces the amount of question answering that has to happen between organizations, because someone who wants to use your stuff can just go look at your GraphQL schema. That's going to be documented, so they get that for free. They can hop into the kind of interactive GraphQL editor that you've set up. It's very easy to spin up and play around with your API. They can get so much more without even having to talk to you, and that means that there's so much less of a barrier to exploring and experimenting and just seeing what else is being built inside your organization. So at SourceGraph, we placed a bet on GraphQL fairly early. We tend to be early adopters of technologies that we think are good in general. We're not afraid to try the latest and greatest. And really it came down to kind of two things. Like one, we had the problem internally, like our own developers were facing the pain that it solved. We hired really great folks, and those folks took a look at GraphQL and said, hey, this is going to solve a lot of our pains, and this is going to make us a lot more productive. And then the second side of that equation is that we actually do have a public API that supports really cool functionality. We basically expose a rich API for querying code as data, which is a really powerful thing for external developers and especially tool builders inside our customers. So our customers are all software engineering organizations, and any smart software engineering organization is going to invest in developer productivity, because if you build a tool that makes every single developer just 1% more productive inside your organization, that's going to pay huge dividends across your entire team and your entire company. And so these tool builders, they basically come to us and say, we want SourceGraph not just for the end user use case of being able to search and explore your code really easily. We want to build other tools on top of the SourceGraph API that take advantage of it fully and that are rich themselves. Refactoring tools, or security vulnerability detection tools, or tools that give engineers a better high-level view of different parts of the code base. All these are tools that are really rich in functionality. They're not just making simple create, update, delete requests to specific resources. They really want to pull data from a variety of different kind of endpoints and synthesize that into something that makes your life as a developer inside one of our customers easier. And so we really wanted to be able to enable and empower not just the end users, developers, but also the tool builders as well.